This is a production of WKNO Memphis. Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
The interim superintendent of the Unified School District, Dorsey Hobson, tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, publisher of the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for joining us. We are joined tonight by Dorsey Hobson, interim superintendent of the Unified School District. Thank you for being here.
I am pleased to be here.
Absolutely. And Bill Dries, senior reporter with the Memphis Daily News. Let's start with a basic question, a question I think that's on everyone's mind on some level is, can the Unified School District, can this consolidation be successful given all the uncertainty about the municipal school districts, municipal schools breaking off a year from now? Can this still be successful?
Absolutely. I think that, one of the phrases we heard a few years ago when the financial meltdown occurred was that the banks were too big to fail. Well, this is too important to fail. I think that the infrastructure is in place for us to have a successful school year next year. One of the things that the board has been clear on and that we've been clear on is that the school-based experience is just not going to change unless it changes for the better. If you're a child and you go to school in Arlington, you'll be going to school in Arlington next year. Your faculty is not going to change. Your school experience is not going to change. Similarly, if you go to school at White Station, that's not going to change. So the school experience is already in place. Now we have some operational things that we're going to have to get done between now and the start of school, and that will be challenging. But regardless, we're going to make sure this thing gets done and gets done right.
With the prospect that you mentioned Arlington and Cordova, Collierville, Germantown, that they may well break off. We've had the folks from those communities on the show, and they said, yeah, they're going to go forward with voting and breaking away. Do you just put blinders onto that fact, or do you have to incorporate that likelihood into your planning now?
Well, I think the most important thing for us is that we know that we will be a unified school district next year. So therefore, we have to take into consideration what's best for all the kids. Even though it's very likely that they may start their own school district, the following year or whenever, we can't really be concerned about that. I think we have to make smart decisions about the way we deliver high quality education, and those decisions are going to last whether we have 100,000 kids or 150,000 kids. So I think the planning with respect to next year doesn't change, but I think that long term we have to put something together that's sustainable regardless of the number of kids that we're ultimately serving.
Bill.
You have talked a great deal in the last several weeks about what parents are hearing at their school level about staffing decisions. Right. And there's been some confusion because people are thinking that these decisions are a function of schools consolidation, and they're not. Right. Can you run through basically what is happening to staffing at the schools levels, especially in what are now the county schools outside of the city?
That's an excellent question. And, staffing is primarily driven by funding and enrollment. Now, the county schools had a much richer staffing formula than the Memphis City schools did. And they supported that with their fund balance. And they just made a strategic decision to say we're going to take our savings and spend it to keep this more rich staffing formula. And I think that's a good decision because we'd all agree that the more teachers you have, the better. But if you look at where their fund balance is now, they're going to be out of fund balance this year. So they would have had to make staffing cuts at the school level next year anyway. I think that one thing that gets lost is I think they cut about 120 teaching positions last year, and it wasn't magnified because it wasn't done at the same time as the merger. So the notion that they're losing positions solely because of the merger is just not true. But what we essentially do is we look at the enrollment, we look at the budget, and then we make projections. Now, I think about 3 years ago, the Memphis City schools reduced their staffing formula to save money. Same concerns with the Memphis City schools, teachers and community. Hey, you're reducing the level, and they made do. So what we initially sought to do was harmonize the two staffing formulas. When we looked at using just the Memphis City schools formula across the board, it really led to some draconian cuts for some of the suburban schools. So we said we're not going to do that. We took a first cut at a staffing formula, and it even still we thought took too much of a toll on some of the county faculty. So then we went back to the drawing board again, and we came up with something that we thought would at least enable the county schools to continue to offer the high quality educational opportunities that they are offering. Now, there were some reductions, but I think that's more a function of budgetary issues in general than the merger.
Is there a chance, I know in the past when we've talked about positions being surplus, that those teachers have eventually found a position, in most cases somewhere else. Will that happen with this?
Yes, we're confident. And I think that, I'm so glad you guys are giving me an opportunity to talk because I think that, one thing I've learned through this whole process is if people don't know facts, they tend to make them up. And I think just with the merger and all the uncertainty, it's easy to sensationalize things and make inaccurate statements. Surplusing or excessing just means you look at a school, you look at the enrollment, and you figure out how many teachers you need. Just because a teacher gets surplus or excess, what they do then, they have an opportunity to apply different places. I think last year the Memphis City schools hired about 1,100 teachers. We anticipate there'll be at least that many openings this year. So I think we have about 186 teachers who were surplus. But we anticipate there being 11 or 1,200 vacancies before the beginning of next school year. So I am confident that, and I can say unequivocally, every good teacher will have a position with the unified school district if they want one.
I've heard people, and you talked about people not having the facts, so this may fall in that, but I've heard people say, well, part of that surplusing and that dynamic is an effort to get really good teachers from the county area into the city schools, a kind of a robbing the suburbs to bring these teachers in, a conspiracy of sorts.
I'm glad you mentioned that because that's just not true. The principals have an opportunity to decide who they're going to surplus. I think one thing that I hope we get a chance to talk about is that where traditionally seniority has been a big driver, now it's basically based on performance. So if you're a suburban teacher or a suburban principal and you know your staff, you pick who's surplus. So obviously you're going to pick you're going to keep your high performing teachers. So there's no correlation whatsoever between the surplusing process and moving faculty members around to send one person from the county to the city or vice versa. I mean, we've said all along, with respect to the merger, there's not going to be any busing. There's not going to be any mass exodus of faculty. There's not going to be any transferring one faculty person from one school to another. I mean, the board passed a policy where essentially when you do transfers and excess, and we move towards mutual consent. So if a teacher is going to be somewhere, the principal has to want the teacher there, and the teacher has to want to be there. So absolutely no truth at all to the notion or assertion that this excess has anything to do with moving teachers around from one district to the other.
And does that change from seniority to performance? Correct me if I'm wrong, some of that came from the state, right? I mean, some of that came with changes that were passed in the Haslam administration that, shockingly enough, had nothing to do with the merger. I mean, for us, we're so merger-centric in how we view these decisions. But there's been a huge amount of change in state law that has, from a teacher union point of view, broken the power of the union, from another reformist point of view, enabled principals and administrators to hire good teachers and not be stuck with teachers who maybe are the most senior but not the highest performing. So is that part of what's in play and part of what parents maybe see and don't, and they associate with the merger, but is actually a change in state law? You
are absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that is interesting is that with all the change going on here, I mean, we also are in the middle of high stakes educational reform. Right. One thing I think that I'm very proud of, I think the legacy Memphis City schools, they started the Teacher Effectiveness Initiative. And that program of work really tracks what's going on in state law. So the essence of it is that you want to make sure that every classroom has a high quality teacher. And there are different ways to measure high quality teachers, different ways to compensate high quality teachers. But at the end of the day, the focus in state law and in what the Memphis City Schools was doing with the TEI proposal before state law even changed is to make decisions on hiring with respect to teachers and evaluations or what, based on performance. So that is the real driver. It's not, you know, it's really it really has nothing to do with the merger. It just happens to be going on at the same time.
Well, another thing that's coming from the state, there's a bunch of different directions I can go, but let's go with charter schools. Yes. The caps on charter schools, the city of Memphis has had quite a few charter schools for some time, but again, Haslam administration, legislature removed the cap, and there's an explosion really on the way in the number of charter schools. People blur this together, but let's try to make a distinction. There are charter schools, and then there are the charter schools within the Achievement School District.
That's
the
correct.
Achievement School District, which is the group that is the state-run group that's taking over failing schools, many of them in Memphis.
That's correct.
How has that changed? How does that impact your planning on this merger? When you've got all these charter schools coming in, is that a good thing? I guess we start there.
Well, let me say this. I think that you know, we have so many failing schools in Memphis, and well, let me say it like this. I mean, when you look at the ASD, what the ASD does is they take the bottom or the lowest performing 5%, and then they're eligible for the state to come in and take them over. I think that with the number of those schools in Memphis, we need to do something different. You know, I don't view charter schools or the ASD as bad. I think we need to be partners in this work. If we have been unsuccessful in reaching a certain population of students and someone else can come in and do it better, we should be happy about that. Yeah. So I think that you know, the tension though is that when a charter school comes in or when the ASD comes in, the funding for those students follow the kids. So then it makes it somewhat difficult to plan, you know, from a fiscal standpoint. And then, but even a bigger challenge that concerns me is that, you know, because the ASDs and the charter schools don't have some of the regulatory constraints that the main school district have, then they're able to offer, you know, teachers different compensation packages. And so with the focus on teacher effectiveness now, you could have, you know, a very high performing teacher with the school district, and then they easily can get picked off or recruited by the charter schools or the ASDs, and that's a tension.
Chris Barbick, who is the superintendent of the ASD, was on the show a month or two ago and, you know, talked about hiring teachers at $60,000, $70,000, $80,000, $90,000, and I'm sure you know, you're happy for those teachers, but that's a tough bit of competition in terms of retaining good teachers.
I mean, the most important factor in students achieving is their teacher. Yeah. I mean, so you know, anytime. I mean, I think teachers, you know, certainly have not been compensated commensurate with their worth. And I think that the state and charter schools are smart to offer higher incentives for them to come work for them. Now, one thing I want to just note that our board did, I thought was very courageous the other day, was they allowed the administration to begin working on different compensation structures for teachers that allow the district to consider things, not just seniority and tenure, but rather performance and student output as you develop a compensation structure. That was very important because, you know, we need all we can to retain, you know, our top talent when it comes to teachers.
Bill.
You have a budget proposal that's due at the Shelby County Commission for funding on May 22nd, and obviously you're working on settling that question beforehand. In putting together that budget proposal, are you working on an assumption that there will only be $5 million in extra funding, or is it $9 million? Because from what I've heard, Mayor Luttrell has included the cost for resource officers in his budget already.
Well, I'm working on an assumption that everyone in the entire community can rally around education. And the reason I say that, I think that if we can show that we are as efficient as we can be, and that there's not a bunch of waste and bloat, that the county commission will take reasonable action to fund a reasonable budget request. Now, the history is this, and you know this, Bill, I think that back in February, January, our board, we had a retreat with the board. We wanted to figure out get some guidance from the board. So the board essentially asked us to approach the commission and ask them for a funding increase somewhere about $147 million. The county commission said, not going to do it. And then we were told around that point in time that there may be around $45 or $50 million potential increase. Since then, we've been told it may not be that high. So what we've done is we've just focused on being as efficient as possible, and we're going to come up with a budget that we feel gives our students the best opportunity to learn. Now, to be more specific, because I don't want to skirt the issue, I think that when the TPC put together a recommendation, I thought they did a good job. There were some assumptions there that ended up not being totally accurate in terms of some of the numbers. But even the budget or the proposal the TPC laid out, it left about a $57 million budget gap. So we've used it as a blueprint, and it's our expectation that we're going to get, we're going to scrub the budget and keep scrubbing. We're going to get even lower than that $57 million gap. So somewhere between zero and $45 million is where we expect for it to be. Now we're going to be very responsible though, because we're going to have an ask. I suspect that we're working really hard to get it down to about a $45 million gap. But we're also going to do the work to show that if it's not funded at that level, we're going to be able to show what it's going to look like if we get down to zero. Mm-hmm. And I think the main driver, as you know, for school districts are employees. So what we do know is that at the end of the day, if we go back to that Memphis City Schools staffing formula, that may save an additional $25 or $30 million. So that may have to be on the table if we don't get funded. Now, nobody wants to do that. And I think all the educators from Legacy Memphis, Legacy Shelby County, people in the community don't think that's best for kids. But we will be able to show how we get it down to zero, even if there's no money available at all.
Mm-hmm. In this first school year of the merger, it increasingly sounds as if we're going to have both school systems under one roof, and we'll have a set of common rules for them. But in terms of the experience, if there is a county schools experience, a city schools experience, those are still going to be in place at least for the first year of the merger.
Yeah, I think that we're shifting to Common Core, and I think the focus in both school districts has been ramping up towards Common Core. Anyway, so we're going to continue those academic focuses.
I'm going to interrupt just to say the Common Core is a set of standards coming from the federal government, correct? And it to some degree, in layman's terms, replaces No Child Left Behind. I mean, that was the Bush administration plan. People, I think, are familiar by and large with No Child Left Behind, and maybe they liked it or didn't, but this Common Core standards is, again, not a function of the merger. It's something that was coming down from the federal government anyway.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
And I think that since, fortunately, I think both school districts have been ramping up to focus on that anyway. So we're not going to have a bunch of, new initiatives. And I think that, back to your point earlier, when you look at planning, I mean, I don't think it makes a lot of sense to develop a full, academic initiative for both districts when we know that one district where some of the schools may leave. So we're going to stay focused on the basics this year. I think that when people are doing things right, they're going to continue to do things right. When people aren't necessarily doing things right, then we'll focus on that. But I think that, again, I cannot say this enough. I was at Collierville High School a few weeks ago, and the Commissioner of Education was there teaching an AP course. I mean, they're doing a lot of things right, at Collierville. So we're not going to be trying to change that. Similarly as at White Station and Central, I mean, they're doing things right. So those experiences, the curriculum, the processes that are school-based, they're just not going to change.
That's when you mentioned AP classes and changes. That's one thing parents have been real nervous about. CLUE programs for gifted kids, the baccalaureate programs, the number of AP courses. Do you see changes in that?
No.
The number of optional schools, the number of AP courses, et cetera?
Now, the one caveat, footnote, asterisk I would say to that is that now there may be an instance where, because you know, a teacher, or because you lose a teacher, or because your enrollment does not support having an extra class. You could see a outlier here or there where, you know, you may lose a teacher and that may cause, you know, a disruption in some kind of program. But for the most part, no, we're not. We put on. There's not going to be any changes to the CLU programs. There's not going to be any changes to, you know, AP, you know, and the IB, any of that stuff. I mean, our main focus in going into this budget, we've been working this budget every day. We are dedicated to keeping the cuts as far away from the classroom as possible. And we know that, you know, when you have things that are working right, you know, like the AP courses, you know, like some of the CLU programs and things of that nature, I mean, it wouldn't make any sense to do anything with those programs.
Going back to the budget, you talked about the gap. One thing that critics of the city school system, you know, you hear a lot is they had a bloated back office, they had a bloated administration, there were too many deputies and so on. You've gone through a very big layoff of the office. Talk a little bit about the scope of the cuts in what I'm calling the back office.
Well, I mean, you know, I think that the merger does give us an opportunity to really and truly evaluate and analyze, you know, how we deliver services from the central office. When the TPC looked at it, it was their recommendation that we cut 26%, you know, of the central office staff. That was a recommendation that we're following. So I think that what we have basically done has, you know, we've rebuilt it from the bottom up and then from the top down. And there were some efficiencies that we found. I think we're gonna probably save somewhere in the area of about $15.5 million in redoing the central office. And a lot of that is because we're pushing people to do more with less and to come up with designs that are more efficient. Now, I don't necessarily, I think that there always has been this perception that, you know, the Memphis City Schools had an overly bloated budget and all that, but I will say, I will give, you know, Dr. Cash credit in that, you know, he had been cutting, you know, for the last 4 or 5 years. And I think that somewhere around the neighborhood of $60 or $70 million in cuts in staff and that kind of stuff had already been going on. But I think the merger gave us an opportunity to just do a big wholesale, hit the reset button.
Well, another area of cuts that people have talked about for years and was on the table before the merger process started was school closures. Right. You've put that back on the table. I think some 11 schools that you've said formally want to start the process of closing these. Yeah. Those aren't savings for next year, I assume, but what kind of savings could those mean over the long term?
Well, let me just say, I mean, there is a fiscal savings associated with it, but I don't think it's the right conversation to talk about school closures to save money. I think you should be talking about school closures to give students better and more high-quality educational offerings and opportunities. You know, we talked about the AP courses a few minutes ago. You know, I look at a White Station High School. I think they have about 26 AP courses. Well, you know, Northside, Westwood, you know, some of the Carver, some schools we propose closing, together they have 10 AP courses. And a lot of it is based just simply on enrollment. If you have 300 kids, you know, you really aren't going to be able to do anything but offer, you know, the basics. So I think that what I'm proposing we just need to have a comprehensive discussion about right-sizing the district. We've got too many schools. You know, when you have a high number of schools, they're underutilized with low enrollment, and then a lot of them are, you know, in priority status or not performing well, then it just seems to me to make sense to do something different. Now, there is a savings associated with it. I think the fiscal savings, you know, if the board were to close all 11 schools, we just put back in the process, it'd be somewhere about $5.6 million.
Let's start with just a couple of minutes left in the show. You are interim, as I introduced you, superintendent, but just recently the board, I guess, agreed to suspend the search for now for a year for a permanent. Were you happy with that decision on the part of the board? Was that expected?
Well, you know, I think it's a, you know, mixed emotions. I would just say, I mean, look, I mean, I relish the opportunity to lead and to serve, and I think that this is really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Right. You know, I mean, I can't imagine a more historical occurrence than merging these two schools, and the fact that the board had the confidence in me to allow me to drive the process. I mean, I'm humbled by it, and I really appreciate it. Now, having said that, it's a tremendous amount of work and a tremendous amount of pressure, and it's just a huge undertaking. So I think that at the end of the day, I'm excited about it. We're going to get it done,
Any chance that you will put your name in the hat for that permanent position? No. That has not changed. No. Okay. Just a minute left. Your relationship with the board. People have criticized the board for being slow moving, being too bulky. What is your view of working with such a large board?
I mean, I don't think our board gets enough credit. I think that the special master stated the other day that the board is very representative of the community. And when you got such a wide range of people with such a wide range of thoughts, I think that you're going to have a slow process. Now, having said that, all of those individuals and I know them all personally, they care about kids, they care about this process, they spend hours upon hours wading through all these details really for nothing, and I think they deserve credit.
And you mentioned the special master. When the special master was appointed by the federal judge, some people thought he'd sort of come in and be almost the superintendent. It hasn't been that kind of relationship, but how is your relationship with the special master, Rick Masson?
They could not have picked a better person to serve in that role.
Okay. Well, thank you for being here, Dorsey Hobson, Interim Superintendent. Thank you, Bill. And thank you for joining us. Join us again next week. Good night.